How's everybody doing today? Seems like people are nice and talkative. It's fun to see.
It's the weather.
We're pretty much all back too. Oh, you mean the cooler weather? Yeah, it's nice. I'm enjoying the weather too. So, anything people want to ask or say before we plunge forward, particularly about the class or assignments? Do people see that I gave feedback on their research question? So you should have feedback on that now.
Where do we see that at?
On Blackboard. So just embedded. I don't actually have no clue what it looks like on your end when I make comments on Blackboard, because like it doesn't look the same on my end. Somebody would like to show me that at some point. I kind of appreciate it actually. But you should be able to access it somehow connected to
the document.
Yeah, to the document, or it's in your grades or something. I'm not really sure where it would be, but in one of those spaces, you should be able to see the comments I made.
If you go into your grades, like where it shows like the however many out of 25 or whatever, there should be a little comment bubble next to it, and if you click on it, you can see it.
Yep, so that's where I'll usually have a full description, and then on the document itself, I'll sometimes put notes in, but those aren't usually things you lose points for. It's just things like, this should be another paragraph, or something like that, or why'd you suddenly change fonts, or why is this in purple? That was one of my comments today. Somebody sent me a document where everything was in purple, and I'm like, what? I mean, I like purple, but like, there's a time and place, right? So yeah, so that's, make sure you look that over. At some point this week, I'm gonna actually pull back up that research design document. We'll talk about the different parts of it so you know exactly what I'm gonna be expecting. This week is the week where we cover the last two of our different types of designs. So today we're gonna talk about qualitative, and then Thursday we're gonna talk about unintrusive data. Okay, any questions or thoughts before things go on? Yeah.
Do you know when our abstract is due? Is it this week or next week?
October. It's whatever it says in the syllabus. You said this week? Yeah. I know it's like, you know, as a professor, like I often don't know when my assignments are due, because I know like when they end up in my needs to be graded, then I need to grade them, and then they become homework for me. So, so generally speaking, just follow the syllabus. Okay, other questions? Cool. Let's go ahead and talk about qualitative. I think as we shift into qualitative, it's useful to kind of think about qualitative is more of a series of debates about good practice than it is actually like set rules. So a lot of qualitative researchers have huge, and you probably picked this up when you read the chapter a little bit, huge disagreements on what we should actually do when we're doing field research. So we're going to kind of go through today some of those different well, we're going to start going through the different situations where you often use field research. So what sort of questions are you going to use field research for? Then we're going to talk about a series of debates, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the tools and just some good practices when you do specific kinds of qualitative research. So, okay, so if you guys did not look at this yet, on page 297, it gives kind of like a long list of different times you're likely to use qualitative research. Also should be commented on that generally you teach these things as separate, but a lot of times people use mixed methodologies. So you may have, and if you've read enough studies, you've probably seen this, where one of the researchers mostly does quantitative, one mostly does qualitative. They work together and they create this sort of combined research project. So you can combine these. There's debates about whether that's good or bad, right? Because if you're thinking about just like last week, this week we're going to talk about certain limitations or certain kinds of questions that one's better at than the other. So whether combining them is just taking the worst of both and plugging them into one another and using them when they're inappropriate, or if there's actually a good reason to do that, is kind of It's a question that's often asked. But if you're interested in doing data stuff with the government, and this is probably me particularly looking at crim people, a lot of times they like mixed methods. In academia, you're more likely to have people who are qualitative or quantitative and refuse to do the opposite. So, just as a heads up. Okay, so what kind of situations are they useful for? We just started going through these.
Practices,
And what does that mean?
like a book, like reading a book or article or something.
So what else could be a practice? I think that's really bad. Who does a qualitative study watching people read? Seriously. What's a practice?
Something somebody does.
Yeah, basically, yeah. So you're looking at literally like how is it that people in a detailed sort of way do something, right? That's kind of what his point is so like, you can think about this when we talked about like the breaching studies, which we'll also give a nod at, right? How do people react when you stand the wrong way in an elevator? It's essentially a study of practice, right? A lot of conversation analysis would fall into this. How is it that, people take turns when they're speaking? How is it that they, move from one topic to another? How is it that they're essentially detailing out practices by watching people actually do these things, right? Make sense? So there's one setting, practices. What else?
Episodes,
Yeah, what does that mean?
things, actual things that happen between or with a person, such as fighting. I think the book gave examples of divorce, and I think it gave another example of crime, illnesses. What we're going through now with the pandemic, how people are getting sick.
So let's take that apart. How would you study that?
Well, you have to-
Qualitatively.
You have to select, we'll just say Benedictine kids that are come back to school, or Benedictine kids that are from California versus the kids that are from Texas, how they were affected by the pandemic or the illness.
I think we're thinking very quantitative there. How is it that you go about studying an event qualitatively? What are some things you could do?
How it affects like people that are around wherever the event takes place.
Yeah. So particularly like in mind here, it has smaller events in mind, right? So you could study like something that happened. Like I assigned a study to my freshmen on a riot that happened, right? And people's like retrospective memories of that riot 20 years later, right? And that's an example, right? There's an event that happens, and so you're essentially looking at how is it that people are interpreting it, how are people understanding it, right? And so essentially you're analyzing that event. It could also be like a historian, right? You could actually be interested in the event itself, right? Not just people's feelings about it. And you use largely the same methods. You interview people who were there, you try to get from them what happened, right? So this is another good setting that you'd use. And you're going to see some overlap between these. Okay, what's the next one?
It says encounters. I'm just going through it.
Yeah. So I think we could almost like lump these 3 and 4 together, but what's an encounter? Like, what does it mean by that?
If roommates have problems with the sickness, how did they deal with the things that happen between those two in the rooms? How did they isolate from one another and things of that nature?
So yeah, you could. I think that would work. Let's think about a more everyday sort of encounter. Let's move away from the events. What kind of encounter might you study in sociology?
How people greet each other.
How people greet it, yeah. This is more, I don't know why it uses the word encounter. Usually when we talk about interaction in sociology, that's what he's kind of driving at here. So when you look at how people interact, right? Interactions are very important for understanding how we construct meaning, how we understand ourselves. So quite literally, you could understand things by watching people in a certain situation. You can think about things like, I'm sure at least the sociologists in the room have heard of Irving Goffman before. And like Irving Goffman was famous for doing studies like he'd go and he'd get a job as a salesperson. And then he'd, make observations about how salespeople interact with the people that they are trying to sell things to, right? And he'd pull out all sorts of significance on how we understand ourselves and identity on the basis of this interaction. That's kind of what it means by an encounter here. Those are things, once again, very hard to get at quantitatively, right? Hard to ask people questions about something like that, right? So you'd use a qualitative. And that's kind of the theme, a running theme is things that are hard to get to just by asking people point blank what they think about things. That's when you're going to use qualitative, right? Okay, so roles and social type, right? This is the same sort of, I said we could almost lump that together. You can think about when you learn about roles, whether you're talking about the social psychology end of criminology or the social psychology end of sociology, people's roles and identities. How do they perform their roles? What sort of things do they do, right? All those sort of questions. All that came out of qualitative research. Relationships, which I think we could also think of that very much so interconnected to, right? Our relationships in a lot of ways are our roles, how we play them with one another, right? How do those pan out? How do we develop those relationships? How do we maintain them, right? All that would be qualitative stuff. Small groups of people. Why would you use qualitative for small groups of people usually? I guess.
You could see if you could observe any patterns occurring in the small groups.
Yeah, you would look for patterns. You could try to understand what they think about the world. You could try to understand what they do. Why wouldn't you use a survey for those things?
It's not big enough to like get really numerical data.
Yeah. It's not even big enough that if you collected statistics and you ran it would actually not mean anything. So usually you're not going to study small groups of people. If people wanted to understand, I don't know, just this classroom worth of people, right? If it was like, oh, we're interested in the event of what happens in this classroom, they're not going to survey all you guys. It'd actually be a really bad method because there's not that many of us. The amount of numerical data, what we can run is pretty much very limited. And they'd probably be better off interacting with you all on some level, talking to you, right, observing you, doing something that wouldn't fall under the guise of something quantitative, right? Organizations, formal organizations, right? There's been a lot of studies of formal organizations, organizational structure that have to do with qualitative things. Particularly like anytime you're trying to get that like muddy stuff about relationships between people and how they work. Because like if you think about formal organizations, they're going to say one thing about how they work, and then it's actually going to work very differently, right? So if you think about it like, has anybody here ever worked for a big company before?
Home Depot.
Home Depot. So if you were to, would you be able to tell what would happen at the Home Depot you worked at on a day-to-day basis by watching their training videos? No, because actually what happens on the ground is very different than what actually like is formally being said. So a lot of times to understand like the culture behind, right, or something like that, culture behind a place of work or an institution or an organization, people do studies like this, right? So if you really want to know what's happening on the ground, you almost have to, and I would put it this way, if you just want to think about it like quantitative is really good for pie in the sky questions. Big things. Qualitative, anytime you got to get your hands dirty and get in there and figure out what the heck's going on, qualitative is going to be your best bet, right? That's what it's for. It's for kind of that minutia feeling. Once again, just like cliques, just like organizations, settlements and habitats, communities, small groups of people in other countries that formulate like, sort of like anthropological kind of stuff, right? All these things are going to be things that you're primarily gonna subcultures, right? Particularly because they're hard to get to, they're hard to interact with. It's going to be a lot easier to do qualitative work on that. One of the people I took a couple classes from in graduate school studied cult groups qualitatively, so he would go and get to know people and then like just live on a cult compound for a month or a year and just sort of like observe what happened and how people talked about what they were doing and stuff like that. All those kinds of studies, right, would fall under fall under things that you'd normally do qualitatively.
Did
You guys
do you have a problem with finding a group that will let him in to do that type of study?
Actually, no, he really didn't. He actually ended up like, as he got older, stopped doing things with a lot of like groups that didn't like necessarily have, because most cults don't have names and they're all around and people just don't really know that they're there. But anyways, like he kind of focused on those sort of groups, but that became really problematic with the IRB because you have to know who you're going to talk to beforehand. And so in some ways he shifted what he did, but he never really had a problem getting entrance into that. I'm not really sure. It was possibly though because he grew up Christian Science, which is kind of a weird fringy version of Christianity. This is not to like, I'm not trying to insult people by using those terms. If anybody's Christian Science, I apologize. That's not, I didn't mean weird in like a negative way, but it is itself a sort of
Unorthodox?
it's an unorthodox form of Christianity. So I think that probably gave him a lot of like inroads into meeting and talking to people from those other groups, having grown up in that. So yeah, so these are the settings, right? So that's the one thing to think about, and that should help us too, like as we're moving forward to the research designs, right? Once again, the question, what method should you be using? It's going to depend on what question you're asking, right? And which is going to be appropriate. Okay. Make sense? Any questions on those? Okay, the next thing is sort of a series of decisions in some ways you'd have to make if you're going to do qualitative research. And like I said, rather than sort of like where with a lot of our quantitative stuff it was like, if you want to do this, then you must do this. Where in qualitative it's going to be more like, people sometimes think this is better. Sometimes some people think this is better. A lot of people think it depends on what you're doing, right? And so that if you think of it that way. So one of the things is, the important things to get down is the different roles of an observer. Field research, by the way, and the textbook doesn't use this term, it just uses the term field research, is often referred to as participant observation. Right? And the reason why he doesn't want to call it participant observation is because of these different roles of the observer, because it sort of indicates one over the other. Which the question is to what degree should the observer, and it wants us to think about this on a spectrum, to what degree should the observer try to be a complete participant versus a sort of like disconnected, complete observer. Do you ever pick up on the difference between these two, what they would look like? So let's stick with that hype that I nodded at the having studied under somebody who did study cult groups, right? Like, what would it mean to be a complete participant in a cult group?
That means you're full involved.
Yeah, I just think you're going to go and join them in what they're doing.
Could you speak a little louder?
You're joining them in what they're doing.
You're going to definitely join in. Yeah, if you're doing, if you're a complete participant, you're definitely going to be joining in what they're doing. What else are you likely to have? What would make you a complete participant?
That you believe in what they're pushing out.
Yeah. Yeah, so on the scale of complete participant, you're going to take on the attitudes of the people being studied, as well as the behaviors, right? You're going to follow along in whatever they do, right? You're also going to take on their attitudes.
Wouldn't that skew your opinion pretty much?
Well, this is a big debate within qualitative stuff. Is should qualitative researchers strive to be objective? I'll get into that a little bit too. Because not everyone thinks that objectivity is either real or should be tried to be accomplished in qualitative circles. So on this end, yeah, you're totally gonna like own the group of people that you're with. Depending on who you're studying and what you're doing, this might not really be that problematic, right? And like part of this too, like a good example, I assigned an article for a class a couple years ago where it was talking about drinking stories, right? And a lot of the students were a little disturbed by some of the content of people's drinking stories, right? And it's like, well, the field researcher was just taking on the attitudes of the people, right? He has no commentary on whether it's good or bad. Has no like, he's not necessarily promoting it or not promoting it. He's just sort of taking on their attitudes and representing it, right? And you see that a lot in qualitative work. They won't even really edit what people are saying, doing, thinking. They won't really try to even like sometimes theorize about it. They're literally just presenting the attitudes of those people as honestly as they can, right? Okay, complete observer on the other hand, you're not going to, if you think about this as going to be more like you standing on the outskirts, like watching people do stuff but not doing anything with them, right? And that's kind of on the other end of the scale. People who fall to the complete observer often talk about developing an attitude of strangeness. Right? And an attitude of strangeness, and this is particularly like if we think about, I talked about Irving Goffman studying salesmen, right? We have and often complete observers kind of are from doing this kind of research where they're taking something really every day and they're trying to understand it very differently. So rather than just sort of taking on the attitudes of salespeople about what it means to be a salesperson, they're just going to walk into it with an attitude of strangeness. A lot of people refer to this also as like the Martian, right? So the idea of like you're stepping in and you're pretending like you're landing down on a planet and you don't really know what's going on, right? If you go far enough onto this end of the spectrum, there's people who will prefer to just watch what people do and they won't even care about like what words people are saying or how they're speaking, right? They're just going to be like full on watching. Like people do studies of like, things that people do in parks or something like that, right? And there'll be examples of this. The example of negative research that we talked about, Lloyd Humphrey, do you guys remember that? Lloyd Humphrey did the bathroom studies. And you remember that, where he watched people have gay sex in bathrooms? And so, like, Lloyd Humphrey was all the way over here, right? Like, he's simply, like, showing up there, he's watching what people are doing, he's recording it, right? He's walking into it with this sort of attitude, right? So, most researchers are going to fall somewhere in between. Very few people actually take on the perspectives fully, right? They may give them lenience, and they might listen to what they say, and they might report it back honestly, but they don't necessarily try to take on their perspectives, right? So that's going to fall a lot further over here, but it's not going to be complete, right? So these are more like extremes that very few people fall on, right? And most of the time, most researchers are going to try to somehow like negotiate between these two. Makes sense? So you think about it, and that's actually like, if you really think about qualitative research, it's often taking goals that you have and then finding ways of negotiating between them, right? So like being disattached has its place. Being engaged with them has its place. When and where you do what is an open question, right? I'll give you an example of one that's debated a lot. In anthropology, they debate a lot like drug use. And whether if you're going to study a group of people who use drugs as part of their religious practices, do you use the drugs? Do you not use the drugs? Is there a benefit of experiencing what they experience versus not, right? This could be like doing hallucinogens within a certain context or something like that, right? And that would be a question, right? Or if you're like to go study like Aboriginal Australians practice, they take part in like really heavy drinking as part of their rituals, right? Do you do that? Do you not do it, right? And the question of the ethics of that is kind of an open thing. Like I've read some really good work by people who do things like go and study a religious group and actually take part in it. I've read good studies of people who do the opposite.
So I got a question then.
Yeah.
As the observer, if you're looking to balance yourself either way, still when you're observing, you still must maintain the trust in the people that you're observing.
Yeah.
They're going to fully give you the true sense of what you're looking for and not fake it, because, I mean, is that like a fine line? Because if you go in trying to balance, some people are going to believe you're for real trying to do this study, but then there's going to be some negative thoughts too, that you're just trying to, write something bad about it.
Yeah, and this is so one of the big things, and then they talk about this in terms of, they use the term reflexivity, or sorry, not reflexivity, reactivity. They use the word reactivity in the textbook, and reactivity is the idea that and this is always true, right? Whatever you study changes. You change whatever you study. This is referred to as reactivity. So in sociology, often this is referred to as the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect, it's referred to this, Hawthorne was a sociologist who studied factories. And in particular, like, he was going in and doing things like figuring out like what made people work harder, what changed people's attitudes that you could do in a factory. And he did this study on lighting, how lighting affected workers, right? But what he found is no matter what he did to the lighting, people's productivity increased. So like, if he turned the lighting down, it increased. If he turned it up, it increased. If he changed it to fluorescent, it increased. If he took that away and changed it back, it increased, right? And at first he starts interviewing the people to try to figure out what this is. The thing was they were just changing their behavior because they thought it was nice that he was trying to make their work environment more pleasant. So like the idea was he was creating this weird reactivity where like they were just changing what they were doing because he was there, right? And so that's actually a common problem. Like, regardless of what you do, whoever you study, they're going to change their behavior, right? And that's part of this discussion. A lot of these discussions is like, how do you do that, right? And in some ways, like, is it the ways that you can do that sometimes, are they ethical, right? Because like, if you think about like, say you're going to study, I don't know, like a political movement, and you go and you show up to their meetings and you act like you're completely a part of them, right? Is that ethical? Probably not. You know, if you're talking about like the IRB ethical standards, it's not very. And then the question is then, do you actually influence the group because you're actually like a part of their decision-making process, right? Is that going to be more of an impact than if you just are like, I'm a researcher, interested in political process, I'm going to sit here with my notebook and listen to what you guys say, right? And going back to like, the real answer of it is people don't really know, and there's strong feelings on all sides about what you should and shouldn't do. But yeah, that's a good question. And so in this case, like taking part in their ritual, does that earn their trust? Or are you then like altering their ritual because they got to like stop and explain to some foreigner what they're doing or whatever, right? Like, is that what's happening, right? So this kind of ends up being the question there. Make sense? This is, I think, and you guys already know that I'm a qualitative researcher, right? This is one of the reasons I love qualitative research, is because it's so much more fun functioning in this fuzzy world where like, well, your decisions, like you have to think through absolutely everything. I think this is so much more interesting than like follow X, Y, and Z to get to the result. Now, going back to like, that's not a disrespect on, that's just literally like, I get geeky about questions of like reflexivity and how, or reactivity and like how you keep subjects from, right? I think these sort of nitty-gritty questions are a lot more fun. Okay, make sense? The next thing we should talk about is objectivity. In particular, within debates about scientific objectivity and qualitative research, they're interested in to what degree one should remain scientifically detached So, to what degree you should remain scientifically detached versus take on the point of view of your subjects. So what might be a downside to remaining scientifically detached? Because we don't normally think of that as a negative. How might be trying to maintain being scientifically detached alter what you see? And don't mistake this, like nobody's saying that you shouldn't try to report things accurately. It's more about standpoint towards what the information you collect. Yeah.
I feel like you're not willing to see things from the other perspective, you're just going to be completely in your own perspective, so it may be one of you.
Yeah, it might be, inevitably scientific objectivity limits us because we are always viewing the world from our own perspective. And the good question is like, in some instances, is it always going to be appropriate to have an outside perspective or useful?
So I got a question about that.
Yeah.
So even going into this as an observer, no matter what your study is, don't you have a little feeling or a thought about what you think it is anyway before you actually get into the study?
You should, yeah, and you could claim that, like, no matter what, even in quantitative research, a lot of times you're going in with an idea of what you're going to find, and you'll probably end up finding it, and you may end up finding it whether it's there or not. Yeah, that's totally a question. So
with that going
can you
in
be
with
objective?
that bias, would that kind of make you go towards the way you want to believe first?
So this is so the claim is that the claim to some degree among social scientists, and I think scientists in general, is that objectivity isn't something you do. And not having bias isn't something you do. It's something you try to achieve. It's a goal. Nobody's objective. Anyone who claims they're objective is lying. Right? Or at least misunderstanding their situation. Nobody has objectivity. Objectivity is something you try to have. Right? So this is more of a question of like, should you even try to be objective? Or should you just try to take on, right, and learn about your subjects, and however they influence you is how they influence you, and that's that, right? Is kind of the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like, yeah, like generally speaking, this is going to be true, like people who are going to like, you know, pound their fist and be like, this is objective, like generally speaking, those people aren't going to be scientists. Scientists know. Like scientists know that what they do has, everything is interpreted. And that's kind of the end result, right? So like, regardless of which method you're going to use, you're going to take you're going to collect a bunch of data. And then what you're going to have to do at the end of that is you're going to have to figure out what the heck all that means, right? And that's the level that you can never truly become objective, right? A bunch of raw data is objective. It's also completely and utterly meaningless and has no use for anybody, right? In the moment that we interpret it, though, we're interacting bias, right? And our objectivity declines. Now that doesn't mean, once going back to like this, the idea is that doesn't mean that you just are like, well, whatever, I'm going to say whatever I want and push whatever agenda I want. It's usually not how, like, that's essentially like moving away from doing science at all, right? But the goal is like you try to be objective. Knowing fair well, and knowing that you can't be, in some ways it makes you more objective, right? Because you can be honest about the bias that you do. And this is actually often like one of the strengths of qualitative research is that often they're very reflexive about the ways in which they're biased on their data, right? And then you even think about, did anybody catch the thing about autoethnography? This is so sometimes qualitative researchers, meta as this is, they'll do studies of themselves studying things. And this is referred to as autoethnography. So they actually like collect data on their own like reactions to the things that they study. And when we get to field research, this is also like often qualitative researchers will keep an independent journal from their field research just so they can keep track of their subjective experience so that they can tell whether they're influencing it, right? And so like, there's actually in a lot of ways a lot of concern about avoiding bias. Even though like this idea of removed, and so like objectivity also suggests something else, which is that you're removed from it, right? And the question going back to like, is that removal positive, right? Or is this just sort of like you constructing some sort of, this is particularly pops up a lot in anthropology. So like if I go to say like, you know, I go study some remote tribe someplace, right? And I go there and I'm like, well, I'm a scientific observer and I'm going to have objectivity. And I'm just implanting some sort of like Western ideology that I lay over top of whatever their understanding is. And that's where a lot of these debates about objectivity comes from. Or you can even say like if I go and I study poor people in the United States, right? Am I just taking and using this as a way of like constructing myself as being superior to them rather than taking out their points of view? Does it make sense? That's a big question. And what we're going to see too is like some of the perspectives that don't. Yeah, actually, yeah. I'm going to pause right there and just look at me. Make sense? Okay, any questions so far? You guys getting into the fuzzy world of qualitative research now? Feeling comfortable with that? Okay, the next series, and a lot of these are in some ways overlapping, right? But there's a series of terms that people will often talk about and oppositions people will talk about. Okay, so the next is the tension between what's sometimes called symbolic realism sometimes this is also called methodological relativism versus critical qualitative analysis. So the tension between these two. So we all know the word relativism for the most part. What's relativism? What's that? Yeah, sometimes we talk about it that way.
What was our answer? I'm sorry.
Do you want to repeat it? Okay. Yeah, a lot of times that's how people will talk about it, particularly in philosophical circles. What may be another way of putting that? How do you react to things if you're being a relativist?
How it affects you?
Not necessarily how it affects you. So how do you react to other people's actions if you're being morally relativistic? Which is usually when we use the word relativism. Well, that person does whatever they do, like, no skin off my back kind of attitude, right? That's kind of how that's often portrayed. Methodological relativism is a little different. It's basically like you set aside your reactions, right? So that you can obtain accurate information about what you're studying. So you sort of set aside. Why might that be important to do? Particularly if you're studying stuff qualitatively. Why might it be important to set aside your reactions? What are the sort of things we often study qualitatively? What were some of the things on that list? I had you guys turn to in front of me.
Divorce.
We can start there, yeah. Why not? Let's say you're going to study divorce and the way that divorce impacts people. Do people have feelings about divorce already?
Yes.
And so why might you want to use methodological relativism as a tool? What might those feelings cause you to do?
Because the emotions of it would cause you to kind of form an opinion. You would start feeling sorry for the, you feel for a person that's inside of the divorce. So you want to take yourself out as much as you can, but because of how you feel about the divorce anyway, you may try to be lenient or not do the full research.
Yeah, maybe you're not, and you might just flat out miss what a lot of people are actually saying in those situations because of your reaction, right? So it's particularly like, yeah, you set aside, right, your reactions so that you can hear theirs. Okay, that's kind of what methodological relativism is all about. This comes into play with like, going back to like, and I know I give a lot of like anthropology examples for qualitative, but that's where a lot of this analysis comes from. It originally grew out of anthropology. Like if you were to go to another culture and study them, if you carry your own sort of feelings about human actions from your own culture in there, you're going to miss all kinds of stuff, right? So what do? You bracket out your own reactions. Try to see what they're doing, how they understand it, how they talk about it, right? And that's how you're going to learn about them, right? That's how you use methodological relativism. So for a long time in particular, in qualitative analysis, this was the standard, right? You set aside, this is particularly ever since the early 20th century, right? This was the standard. You go and you study things, you set aside, right, your attitudes, right? You study them as they would themselves want to be studied. How they would want themselves understood, how they themselves understand it is what's important, right? So this puts a lot of weight on other people's understanding. Okay, is this always appropriate? When might that be inappropriate? Or at least you could argue would be inappropriate.
This is kind of really specific, but if you're studying like children, because they, whatever they interpret, they don't understand knowledge that you can like provide, so you use your own reactions to like put it into like a broader perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that might happen like at the moment of interpretation. So like in a lot of ways too, like you may set aside when you're in the field, right? You might be methodologically relativistic, but you're still probably going to attach it to some sort of like outside theoretical knowledge or something like that, right? And so like at the moment of interpretation, you might let that sort of worldview stuff come back in. Yeah.
What if it's something that's like definitely a negative thing, regardless of, because divorce might not actually be a negative thing in one of the circumstances, but like child abuse is definitely a negative thing, and it would be fine way that you don't have a negative reaction.
Yeah, and that's usually where it's when something is inherently negative, often people will instead be like, No, you need to provide a critique of this, right? That and just letting it be, right? So you could do a study, and it might be a very interesting study of child abuse, where you just interview child abusers and get their attitudes and sort of create the social world of child abusers. But there's also like, that might not also be all that positive, right? In some ways you might want to provide a critical analysis of why people do it, right? On the assumption that it's not something you should probably do, right? So there's a balance here, right? What might be another classic example? Can anybody think of other examples of things that might be like that? Things that you would want to study like critically as opposed to
Like trafficking?
Yeah, you could study human trafficking from a non-critical standpoint, right? Where it's just sort of like, yeah, this is the motivation of traffickers, and this is why they do it, and this is how they like it, and yada yada yada, right? So it's not probably gonna get you. Even like if you were to interview people who had been trafficked and just sort of report back on what they say, that might not be as useful as actually providing some sort of critical framework for understanding, like, I don't know, how trafficked women's formulate identities around being trafficked, right? You could think about that, right? And a lot of times too, like when we get into like victimization stuff, do victims usually feel particularly negative about their victimization, or always feel negative about their victimization? No, not always, right? A lot of times people actually justify what happens to them, right? So if you're thinking about like, if you're studying spousal abuse, right? And you were to take on too much of an attitude of methodological relativism, you might pick up on the people talking very positively about their spousal abuse experience, or at least justifying it as being okay, right? And without some sort of further critique, right? In some ways you just end up then becoming an advocate for spousal abuse, right? And so that's kind of a tension, right? A lot of times, have you ever heard of female genital mutilation? It used to be called female circumcision. This is something that's often debated about people's attitudes surrounding that, right? In anthropological circles. How do you understand that, right? How do you interact with it? Do you take on the perspectives of the culture? Do you criticize it from a feminist perspective? Like, which is okay, right? Which is better? And one thing it's open to debate. People do debate that. And generally, and same thing with things like the study of exploited populations, right? So I think about like one of a classic qualitative study is Arlene Hochschild's The Managed Heart, where she studies people like who work on airplanes as stewardesses and things like that, about the emotional labor and how like particularly demanding people to feel and act a certain way around other people has this taxing thing that happens to them, right? She's not gaining that through an understanding of how stewardesses, like it is out of things that they say, right? But that's not their self-understanding of their work. It's when she applies this sort of critical, like Marxist feminist lens to airline stewardesses' descriptions of what happens when they come home after smiling all day at the people that they take care of, right? That's where she's getting it from, right? So she's pulling that out because of her theoretical, right? So that's kind of the tension here, right? Do you provide a critical critique of it, right, or don't you? Make sense? And this is a huge ongoing debate. This one, if anything, if any of these, I think like really pops up as something that like people feel very vehemently strong about and argue very it's a sort of really active academic debate where people sometimes talk past each other even. It's probably this one. There's a lot of people in qualitative circles who don't respect people who do the other. Okay, make sense? One last term, and this is more just a term. than an actual. So everything else has been a decision or tension. So when you guys are writing about your method, right, you can use any of this language to kind of flush out exactly what you're thinking about doing, right? Do you want to do a critical analysis of X, Y, and Z? Do you want to, right, immerse yourself in your observations, right? Do you want to, it just depends, right? You'll get very different results if you were to actually do it, depending on which direction you take. Okay, 2 terms is emic and etic. So, and this is sometimes used it's used in this way in the book where it talks about emic and etic perspectives. Sometimes this is also referred to whether the concepts you're discussing should be emic or etic, or are they emic or etic, right? Emic means that you take on your subject, so it's your subject's, right, perspective. It's your subject's point of view, it's your subject's concepts. And in etic, it is the researcher's point of view. It's the researcher's concepts. So can we think of an example of what might be like an etic concept? Or let's start with emic. What would be an emic concept you might use in research, or maybe a study you've read in the past that uses? Let me think of an example. So I'm going to start with a criminology example. Have you guys ever heard of the culture of honor stuff? This was a big qualitative criminology thing for a while, where it was analyzing like the honor culture surrounding violence. So like, to what degree were you committing violence because you had to stand up for yourself, or being disrespected, like culturally elicited a reaction, right? And you can understand crime through this sort of culture of honor narrative. Would that probably be an emic or an etic concept? Emic? Why do you think so?
Because to think that someone had to do something because that's the way they grew up culturally, they had to fight if they were disrespected in some way. According to the neighborhood they grew up in, they had to protect themselves. Because of some of the abuses that they received as a young person, they had to protect themselves. They didn't have a big brother or sister or older sibling. They had to protect themselves.
No one else want to weigh in? Yeah, it isn't. And the reason why it's emic is it's from the, it's from the perspective of that subject. So like, they're going to talk about their honor. They're going to talk about being disrespected, right? That's how they're going to analyze that. And there's a variety of honor cultures in the United States, right? And in a lot of ways, those are connected to other like forms of honor culture in other societies as well. But in the United States, there's things like Appalachian feuding, right? Is a great example of an honor culture. Somebody disrespects your family, you have to like essentially react to it, right? And a lot of times, like sometimes street gangs work this way, right? Where it's very much so like this sort of like invasion of territory is sort of like this act of disrespect, and people react to it, right? And all those are sort of taking on things from an emic perspective, right? And the concepts that are derived from that are often in the language of the people themselves, right? Which makes them emic concepts. Make sense? Okay, anybody think of an example of an etic concept? They're so close in words, it's really hard not to, like, when you're speaking, just flip them. An etic concept. Take a study.
Could you feel like that bell, like when you ring the bell and then you get hit or something? Would that be?
I think it's more like you're more in like experiment territory. So anything that's coming out of the theoretical world of academics is going to be a concept, an concept, right? So like, you know, when you read a qualitative study and they're talking about, like I did a qualitative study with people a few years ago in one of my undergrad classes where it was like talking to alcoholics. Let me reference it because this is a really good methodological study actually. But anyways, like talking to like getting to know alcoholics' identities by just like hanging out in a bar, right, in the mornings and interviewing people. And it used a lot of like things talking about like the preservation of self-image, right? Whether they were stigmatized, right? And all these sort of terms that are very common in social psychology. Every time they were interpreting through that, they were doing an etic point of view and using etic concepts to understand what the participants in the study said about themselves, right? Regardless of what you're doing, it's going to be the behavior of your subjects and the words of your subject that you're using, right? But how you go to interpret it, right, is really the point where it's going to be one or the other. Right? And you can kind of think of that with all the divisions that we talked about. They're really questions about you as a researcher, how should you interpret and engage with their words and their thoughts and their actions, right? No matter what, you're going to derive your study from because that's your data, right? Just like regardless of what you do quantitatively, you're gonna whatever numbers you get will be what you derive your interpretation from, right? Another way to think of it is qualitative people are a lot more obsessed with what they do after they collect the data, right? So it's very much so being aware of yourself as an interpreter, right? So they can't lean as heavily on like the numbers are what they are kind of attitude. Instead, what they have to do is be very aware of how is it that they are breaking apart, right? How are they pulling meaning out of these things, right? How are they connecting it to the larger scholarly discourse? Okay, some examples of types of research, if you will, types of qualitative research or ways of thinking about it. Then we're going to get into the tools that they use. Maybe not the tools today. Okay, so type of studies that qualitative people will do. One of the most important is ethnography. Right? Ethnographic study. Ethnographic field research. You're in that class right now, aren't you? Who else is in the ethnography course? Just you two? I'm going to ask you guys like an impossible question because you're 5 weeks in. What's ethnography? Yeah, so you definitely like go out into the field and study those things. What makes it different from a different type of qualitative research? A different type of field research? You guys know? You might just not be there yet. When we refer to ethnography, ethnography is particularly about detailed description. And it's about immersion. So usually the goal, if you're going to be doing an ethnography, is going to get to know the group that you're looking at as well as you can. Right? So this is like, you know, a study where like, thinking about like, to pull it to the criminology side, you don't get as much criminological ethnography. You do get some. There's a really great documentary, Heart Broken in Half, that was made by an anthropologist, where he moved into a housing complex and got to know all the teenagers that were in gangs and started like hanging around them for like 2-3 years. Like this middle-aged, dumpy white guy who's an anthropologist someplace, right? But anyways, the point is like, what was his goals? He was trying to immerse himself in their day-to-day lives, right? You know, he would eat the food that they ate, consume the things that they consume, maybe not all of it, right? Going back to like questions about the acceptability of that. He, you know, tried to get to know the ins and outs of their lives. So how is it that they, you know, use meaning, construct identity, use symbols, right? All these sort of like very detailed, and he does like this, almost the whole documentary is on the use of symbols and how it plays out in their lives, right? So like literally sometimes drawn symbols, sometimes ways of moving, sometimes ways of speaking, right? So you guys see that kind of like, that's kind of the idea of ethnography, is you get in there as deep as you can, you immerse yourself as far as you can so you can extract all kinds of things from the perspective of the people there. It's kind of the idea of ethnography. Make sense? Cool. So that's going to be, when you hear people refer to ethnography, that's what they're going to mean by it. It's one way of doing qualitative research. What might be a downside to ethnography? Yeah, out of all of our perspectives, ethnography is the most time-consuming. It's a very time-consuming method. So that's in a lot of ways like kind of one of the archetypes of it. Okay, another example. You might do qualitative case study. Have you ever heard that term before? Yeah, it's something we kind of throw around, I think. How many examples do you take in a case study? Yeah, you take a case. So if you're interested in, and these things don't necessarily separate, like these things can overlap, like an ethnography can overlap with a case study. But a case study, yeah, you take one example of something, and you're often interested in larger phenomena. So you can think about a classic case study would be Durkheim did this study of Aboriginal peoples in Australia called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. He's actually interested in how religion works in all societies. He's interested in the difference in how religion works between modern societies and stuff that came before it, right? But he's only looking at the history and the analysis of one group of people, right? And that's an example how a case study works. You do a detailed analysis of one group with the hopes of sort of like building an understanding that can be applied elsewhere. Another good example of case study methodology would be like, if you think about psychology, often uses this. So when people use their patients as examples, so you can think about like Freud writing about people's dreams, right? That's essentially like, actually most of his dream stuff grows out of one guy, right? Who was referred to as the wolf man in his study because he thought he was a wolf. And that was like the one case study that he used to build his understanding of dreams, right? In his early work, right? So later work he did some other stuff, but that'd be an example, right? Psychologists do this method all the time. That individual case is an example of something. It's really good if you're talking about rare things that you don't get to interact with a lot, right? You could use case study methodology. Okay, makes sense? Cool. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. When we get back, we're gonna talk about grounded theory, institutional ethnography, participant action research, and emancipation research. We're also going to talk about how to do interviews as well as observation.
Too Marlon.